Software interviews. Who's the one on trial here? I'm Ray Myers and welcome to Craft vs. Cruft. And for our special 100 subscriber episode, thank you everyone, we have, for the first time, a guest. We have Mr. Stephen Weinberg, Director of Site Reliability Engineering and QA at Morningstar. So would you like to introduce yourself before we carry on here?
Sure. Yeah, I'm really excited to be here. It's been a great fun watching this, your thoughts grow with Craft versus Cruft and laying these out for people. So I'm really excited to be a guest on it. My background, I started out in the late 90s, sort of when everything was possible, and got lucky that the timing was really good for someone with a mathematics and Chinese background to get into tech. So it was definitely not the standard going to school for computer science, coming out, getting an engineering job, and just moving from there. I started out in analytics, worked on project management, database administration, and moved from database administration into software development, and then into DevOps and site reliability engineering. And so it's been fun taking a very convoluted path and taking a tour of all the different areas of technology, or not all the areas of technology, because there are tons that I do not know, but a lot of different areas of technology, and working in both the startup, in the nonprofit, as well as in the sort of established public company space. So it's been a fun ride.
So one of the most requested topics that we haven't covered yet is interviews. And I've done, a number of interviews. I've been on hiring teams before, but I'm probably not the greatest expert. So you were definitely the person I wanted to have on. We dived into the topic, so this could really be handled with a certain degree of gravitas and expertise. How many interviews would you say you have given?
A large number. It's getting up there, and I doubt I've hit 1,000 yet, but I'm probably getting fairly close.
And would that be like phone screen just or
Everything from phone screens up through the sort of in-person final interviews. And then if we're including things like resume reviews, that number goes way up fast. And then I liked how you phrased in the beginning the idea of who's really on trial. There's a lot of selling that I need to do when I am giving an interview, as well as when I am interviewing for jobs. How do I sell myself? But both of those are really, it's important from both sides, that idea of how do we sell ourselves or our companies.
yeah, I'm really fond of saying an interview is a sale. So I'm glad to have you bring that up, because I think there's a lot of things people who do sales know and understand about what it takes to like lock in a deal, that people who are really on either side of the interview process might not be so aware of.
Yeah, it's taken me a long time to become more comfortable with that idea of sales and marketing myself. I started out as sort of your stereotypical nerd, loving Leonard Nimoy, Spock. It's pure logic, and I will express the value that I and my intelligence, and therefore people will want to work with me. And that often doesn't work, shockingly enough. What one person values and what another person values can be really, really different. And so taking the time to think through what will this person that I'm interviewing desire in the company that I work for, or what will this company that I'm interviewing with value in an employee, is a really key piece to know how to approach the interview, so that you either have a chance of getting the candidate to work for you or being the candidate that they want to hire.
So when you think of when you were but a candidate,
Hey, we candidate.
which is really never a phase you grow out of. You just do it
Hopefully not.
less often, hopefully.
Yeah.
But what are some of the bigger mistakes you imagine you can remember yourself making? I did not brief you that I was going to ask you that.
Oh no, I like one of the biggest things is my interview, not my interview, my resume's evolution. the early on, I did a little bit of research coming out of college. How do I write a resume? And back then, dating myself, it was choose heavy bonded paper. It's like, really? Okay. Not so useful these days. But the other big thing was the idea of, oh, you want to start every bullet point with a verb. And so most of my resume work early on was choosing verbs. And that's been something that as I have read more and more resumes, yes, it's good to start with a verb, but it gets so old and so boring, especially if a resume is really long and people are repeating the same verbs over and over. It just looks like you've created a bunch of fluff for me to go through, and is I get why some people want to do it because they think the company is going to try and weed them out with some sort of automated resume review process. But honestly, if you're that worried about a company automating out your resume, it's probably not a company you want to work for. And I get I'm privileged that I'm later in my career. I get to be a little bit choosier about who I work for. But as technologists, right now we're kind of a prize. And so we do get to be choosy, and it's important to think about that. But yeah, that idea of just a resume being as simple as a verb, that was a big mistake I made early on that I don't think distinguished me. Instead, what I do at this point is, again, that idea of how do I think in terms of the value that the company will see? And so I start my bullet points with the value proposition, and then it's the process by which I achieved it. So, for example, um, if I re-architected a system so that it depended less on different other services and was able to release independently. To a non-technical person, not terribly interesting. To a technical person, they're going to want a lot more detail before that becomes interesting. So either way, it's a little bit of a loss. If instead I say something like facilitated our release schedule dropping from 2 weeks to 2 hours by re-architecting towards service-oriented architecture with independent services, everyone can start to understand the value proposition together. The non-technical people are like, ooh, I get to release stuff every 2 weeks or 2 hours instead of every 2 weeks. And the technical people are like, oh, 2 hours. Dang. Yeah, we haven't gotten there yet. And I bet I can see a lot of the problems we'll run into. And this person has experience dealing with some of those. So that switching on the resume was really important. The other thing from an interview standpoint was a lot about the willingness to talk about my mistakes and my weaknesses. So early on, it was how do I make myself look good? How do I compensate for where I think I have a lacking? And as I've gotten further in my career, I have realized that what makes me interesting as a candidate is how I have dealt with things that I don't know, how I have realized where I'm missing information, how I have realized that I'm going in the wrong direction, and how I can figure out how to adjust for those issues. Because inevitably, we all know in our jobs we're going to run into situations where we get into trouble with there's some problem we're struggling to solve. That's why we get paid, is to solve these problems that other people struggle to do. And so knowing someone has that experience of running up against something, struggling through it, and coming up with solutions is much more interesting than kind of I think a lot in terms of game terms these days, but the like I've looked at the evolution of the power chart or the tech research chart, and I've optimized my path to the most important piece on that, and I have delved a straight line through it, and I've leveled up really efficiently. In life, efficiency and leveling up is not very interesting. What makes us stand out is where we've gone in different directions, in my opinion.
Hmm. So that talks a little bit about what the mistakes you made early on, and not having a really having personality in your description, having the value established, as well as just the right level of detail. What are some mistakes that you see the most from people that you see in pipelines in terms of not being able to sell themselves, maybe?
It's similar. It's some of the stuff that makes people less of an individual. So a long, repetitive resume where um, you see talking about C#.NET 15 times, where you see Java talked about all the time, and it's like utilize Java framework to do X. It's like, Okay, enough. We're hiring for a Java position. You know Java. That's table stakes, but I'm not going to interview people just for having table stakes. I want the people to stand out. And so, like, making sure you just have a 1 or 2 page resume that looks good and isn't repetitive gets you many times, that'll be enough to get you through the resume review process. And then once you get through into the first phone screen, like each stage has its own detail of how do you pass through that gate. And so in the resume, it has to be like you can summarize things, you have the basic skill set, and you can convey information clearly. Because a resume is about, can you communicate your worth on a short piece of paper? And if you can do that, great, we want to talk to you. And then that first phone screen is, can you communicate verbally and make us interested in you? So again, a fairly low bar, and it's much more about personality and communication than it is about technical skill. There are some places that'll do more of a technical weeder interview rather than a generic phone screen. And so know which way they're going. If they're doing a technical weeder interview, then I come with a very clear, like, I am choosing to do Java, or I am choosing to do Python, or I am choosing to do .NET. But choose a language that you want to express. Don't say, I'm a generalist, give me whatever you want. And then be surprised when they pick something that you're not the best at. So coming in with clear preparation is really good for those, and being able to communicate clearly. An overarching theme that you'll see through each of these different stages I talk about it is have an opinion, express it clearly and concisely, be willing to take in new information on it. And that's going to be something that will distinguish you in different ways. Then once you get into the further sort of in-depth, either phone or in-person interviews, pre-COVID, it was more in person. These days, it's much more Zoom. Really start to develop a story that tells an evolution of your understanding, the value that you can bring to a company, and how you, depending on the level of the position you're applying for, either how much you influence those around you or you transform the small area that you were in. And so start to really develop that story. And you can do that by making sure when you prep for the interview, you prep what story you want to tell rather than you prep for questions. You prep with a story, and then, kind of like a politician giving a speech or a salesperson giving their pitch, depending on which questions you get asked, you give a different piece of the story. But you've prepared for whatever questions they are with one story that you want to tell, and you keep coming back to your story. And that also will make for a more fun interview in a lot of cases, because you'll start to feel more like a conversation. You're a storyteller, they're engaged with your story, you're asking questions, going back and forth. If your interviewer has fun talking with you and it doesn't feel stilted and like a tough conversation, they're more likely to want to interview you again. There is a high level of bias in interviews, both good and bad. Some of it is the very innocent bias of just, like, for example, I come from a database background and I come from a DevOps and SRE background. So if someone is talking about how they thought about maintainability when they were writing code, I'm going to think more highly of them because I resonate with that. On the bad side, there is bias in terms of gender, in terms of race, and that is something to be aware of, and also in something that we as white men need to help solve. But that's slightly a different track, but just want to get that in there and acknowledge it.
Well, absolutely. I mean, that's an important part of talking about interviewing, and something that, like, as a candidate, you have a limited amount that you can do about.
Yep.
But when you get into the position of being on hiring teams, it's like very much like no one can turn a blind eye to that. It's because it's just too present.
Absolutely. And as the interviewee, as you said, there's not a lot you can do about it. But the one other big mistake that I see people make is they haven't done the research about the company or about the people interviewing them. A lot of times you'll be told who will be interviewing you. Stalk them on LinkedIn. Stalk them on social media. Hopefully not in such a way that becomes too obvious. But for someone like me, I've given talks before. I have a Twitter account. There are various ways to find me and track me down. and get a sense of what my perspective is on things. And then not necessarily in the interview speaking directly, like, Stephen, when you were doing this, da, 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 it's like, you can, just as I said, like, I have a bias towards databases and maintenance and operability. If you start telling stories that you know will resonate with me, that'll be something that'll be much more effective. So you can tweak your story to resonate with the people who are interviewing you. Or if you know that I work for, in my case, if someone's interviewing for Morningstar, if they can talk about ideas about transparency, about independence, about trust, which is one of the things that Morningstar prides itself on, that we were built to try and make financial information transparent, to make it useful to individual investors rather than caught up for just those people in the know. So if you can talk about the ways that your work has achieved a mission that is parallel to the company, that becomes much more interesting. It also allows you to ask much more interesting questions when you get the opportunity in the interview. Not just tell me about a day in the life on the team. That's probably just going to be pretty bland. But if you can ask real questions about either a recent incident that the company has had, like if you're interviewing for Amazon or Google, where they actually publish their incident reports, asking for more details about it, or try like, hey, I've seen something similar to this. Was that one of the things you looked at in when you were trying to track this down? It shows that you've done research. It shows a level of engagement. It shows a level of curiosity that will really make you stand out as a candidate.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I've gotten more advanced, I've learned to do that more because you often do know who you're going to be interviewing with, and it's like it's so easy to outrun the other gazelles in terms of just the most cursory research on this. I know, like, I interviewed with you for Morningstar at one point. It ended up going well. And something that I did in that situation was I found that you had appeared on a podcast and you had talked about like specific things that your team had done as far as reducing, the amount of incidents and downtime. And so, like, okay, now I know, what's on your mind, what your areas of concern are, and I might be able to use that in in terms of steering the conversation, and or even just the right questions to ask. I definitely have started doing more of, like, if you're talking to a recruiter, whoever you're talking to, or even if you don't, whether or not you're looking their name up on the internet, just like, okay, so what does that person care about? Like, what is their focus? And you can bring that into the conversation, and it's just so useful because it's a sale. And that's one of the components of a sale is like asking for information and then responding to it. Exactly. Developing that personal connection of the value. Not that you're just, this is just a valuable product. Like, this has value that relates to you. Are there specific things people have like fumbled on and given an unnecessarily red flag? Like, you mentioned being really honest about your weaknesses. Are there ways people have done that in not a good way?
So there are the two sides of that. There's the one side of, the question I often ask is, tell me about a time where you realized the direction you were going in was the wrong direction and you had to adjust and go in and pivot to a different direction. So that's kind of my general sort of psychological level question, where where do you make mistakes? How do you realize you've made a mistake? What do you do about it? Obviously, I want to hear about it in the very technical lens because that's my take on it, but it applies across the board. So, for example, if I ask that of someone fresh out of college and they're talking about, they've sort of told their story and they respond, well, I've never really run into that. I think back to my college days, and either they have a 4.0 or a 4.2 or some ridiculous GPA, and they've just been blowing me away across the board with the interview, or they haven't done much introspection. And so it sets them up to have a hard time. And even someone who's done really well and has just blown me away, I then start to question how much they'll grow. Because inevitably people are making mistakes. You're running into difficult times. And as I've sort of alluded to, a big thing I'm interested in is how do you deal with things when they get tough? How do you get better? How do you make the area around you better? Because most of my job is dealing with problems that have existed for 10, 15 years and no one's been able to solve yet. And my expectation is it's going to take me 2 to 3 years to even approach solving them if I'm lucky. So I'm expecting to go in a lot of wrong directions. I'm expecting to have to follow, as I like to talk about, sort of a scientific method of develop a hypothesis, experiment, review, grow. So it's important to have that example of here is a place where I realize is going in the wrong direction. The other way that that question can go badly is them telling a story where they were going in the wrong direction. They kept going in the wrong direction. They insisted to go even further in the wrong direction. And at the last minute, something outside of their control happened that saved them. And so there's barely any recognition that they went in the wrong direction. And there is no information about how they grew as a result of it. And so an example of this might be, from my own personal story, a story I could tell that I never do in an interview, is there was one class that I was taking in college, and I wasn't that interested in it. And I stopped making an effort about halfway through. I was doing the reading, doing the bare minimum. I did the paper, and I wasn't studying for the final. I was procrastinating. The day before the final, I climbed up in a tree and was sitting on a tree branch procrastinating on the final, and just was like, oh, well, I guess this is going to go badly. And then I got to the final. On the first page of the final, it said, your current grade is X. Sign here if you would like that to be your final grade, or feel free to take the final. I signed there and turned it in. That's a story that tells me about consistently going in a wrong direction and being saved by something totally outside of my control. And the only thing about that is any good is I was smart enough to recognize I was an idiot at the end. So that's the kind of story you really don't want to tell. The story you do want to tell is something more along the lines of, I was doing a 3-month group project. We had set up an initial schedule, and we were about a month into it, and we started to get off track. We tried to push harder and went for another 3 weeks and realized we were just falling down. And at that point, we had wasted half the time, but we still had half the time. And this is how we reorganized and changed. So yes, you went 6 weeks down one wrong path, but then 6 weeks before the deadline, you made an adjustment. Now, obviously, I'm cherry picking a good layout of it, but you find a similar sort of story from once you've been in the business for a while, there are plenty of stories you can talk about where you're in the middle of a sprint and you realize that things are getting tough and you're not quite ready for the release, and you need to figure out which stories do you take out of the release in order to make sure you reduce the risk and do it properly. How do you as a developer start working differently so that you can take on more of the QA role, so that it's not all left to the end to the QA team? Obviously, in my current role, this is a near and dear piece to my heart, where developers start pitching in and figuring out how they can actually own the automation as well.
We'll have an episode on that.
Yep. Those are the kinds of stories that talk about getting into a tight spot, recognizing the tight spot, and doing something to get out of it that shows an understanding of the root cause of why you got into the tight spot, as opposed to the immediate cause of why you're in the tight spot.
So, yeah, the stories are a big deal. And you mentioned like curating what you want your stories to be. That's a thing you see, you notice when people aren't doing that, because like your question will remind them of something and they'll just kind of brain dump their recollection as it comes in. You know, they won't like take a second to compose it into, well, what's the story that I want to tell in the context of the fact that I'm trying to sell myself. Right. And so, yeah, like have it prepared in advance. Like, how are you going to present it? How are you going to spin any failure in terms of the learning that you had as a result of that? But also, yeah, just don't start brain dumping at random. If you need to take a second in the moment to like, say, well, let me compose my thoughts for a second and like come back 10 seconds later and like, all right. And that's certainly, to me better than just rambling for 5 minutes about a story that it's not really clear what the point is, or where you're unintentionally spilling some things you don't want in there, like that sound like you're throwing under other people under the bus, maybe, or otherwise making yourself look bad without the proper mitigation to that, talking about learning or what have you.
Yeah, and tied into that is referring back to previous questions. If you can show, like, as we were recently talking about on the application that we talked about for the last question, these were some of the other aspects that we ran into. So that idea of coming up at the beginning, what is the application that I want to talk the most about? What is the arc that it went from conception through to success or to failure? What were the areas where business value was added? What was the area where business value was taken away? What were the areas where we were able to learn more about architecture? What were the areas we learned more about DevOps? What were the areas we learned about interaction between teams? And think through those things. You can kind of play a game where after you've done enough interviews, you get a sense of what common questions people ask in interviews. Or you can use tools like Glassdoor that have a lot of times interview questions that companies have asked, and you can cheat and just find out, hey, they've asked these 10 questions before. And you try and develop a story that takes into account all 10 of those questions so that try and make the person who is interviewing you have to pause and be like, well, oh, wait, you've answered this, you've answered that. Um, okay, jumping over to here because you've already anticipated 3 or 4 of their questions and given them all the information they need for that. A lot of companies, in order to fight bias, are going all the way to they have very formal interviews where it's a set series of questions. So it's the same question for all candidates. And I love the intent of that. It does make for a very stilted interview, and it puts some level of opportunity or responsibility, depending on how you look at it, on you as an interview candidate to be able to put forward your story more and to stand out as an individual. Because otherwise, it can become very cookie cutter question, answer, question, answer, question, answer. And then, especially when I'm doing interviews, I try and make sure I have time in between interviews so I can take down my notes or I can take enough notes in the moment that recency bias won't come in as high when I'm doing the actual evaluations, because usually the evaluations happen after. But recency bias is a very real thing. Confirmation bias is a very real thing. And so have some make sure you are doing things that will help you stand out as an individual so that even if you are in the middle of an interview pack, you'll be the person they remember, as opposed to, wow, I just interviewed 4 people. They were all kind of the same. And I don't remember enough of the details about any of them. Because that's never a good, if you were one of the candidates, you're not going to get the result you want. And as an interviewer, it's a place where it is unfortunate, but I think it is a reality these days that there are a lot of times where people simply fall through the cracks in the interview process because of where they are in the pack of interviews. There was, I think it was in Freakonomics, where they talked about the people, it was some sort of like loan officers or something, where folks that had the loan interview right before lunch, or it was with judges actually, and the people on the docket for criminal court right before lunch got statistically harder sentences than other people because judges are hungry and in a bad mood. And so there are very real things that will affect your outcome that are totally out of your control. But if you know going into it that that's there are things you can do to prime the interviewer to remember you in a positive way. So, like if you're in the position right before lunch, making a joke about being hungry or about it being right before lunch will acknowledge the potential for that bias in a subconscious way and help you to be remembered. There's a ton of psychology
Man,
things.
I hadn't even thought of that. That's That's an advanced trick.
Obviously I have zero data to show if this works or not, but that's the kind of Machiavellian stuff my mind jumps to. Like when you start thinking about recency bias and confirmation bias and a lot of these, the way biases play into hiring and evaluation decisions, there are ways to game the system. For example, at a new job, making sure on your first few days that you come in early on Mondays and Tuesdays and Fridays because people remember the first and last days a lot more than the middle days, that you dress up for those days that people remember more. There are lots of ways to play with perceptions, and sometimes people notice that you're playing with perceptions, and generally they're amused by it. Sometimes they won't notice and it'll be in your favor, but they're at the very least, it gives you the semblance of feeling like you have some level of control over something you have no control over, which helps you to not feel helpless and powerless.
Yeah, so something that people often say will help distinguish you in an interview is preparing for do you have any questions for me at the end? I'm curious to hear your thoughts on like how much of a factor that legitimately is, but that's something people tell candidates just so we have something to go off of is like, well, definitely have something to say when they say, do you have any questions for me? Last thing you should ever say is, no, I don't. Or to have something really, really superficial. So do you feel like that's been a differentiator when people ask you questions at the end that they've got something so good it changes, where your position is on them?
It absolutely does. If you are in the position where you've had a spectacular interview and you don't have any questions, you're still getting through. Whether or not you'll be like, again, speaking of like, if it's the first interview or the first set of in-person interviews, the goal of those interviews is to get to the next stage. It's not necessarily to be the best. And so at that stage, not having any questions, if you're that good, you'll get through to the next one. If you're middle of the pack, it's a big differentiator because in general, well, I'm making up numbers, but I've done enough that they're moderately accurate. Probably about 10 to 15% of people just sort of breeze through interviews to get through to the final. Then there's about 50 or 60% that are kind of in a gray area. And then there's about 30% or so that are just like, within a few minutes, like this is going to be tough. Either because people answer with very short sentences and don't have any detail, or they answer the same thing repeatedly, or they're sort of like, nope, never made a mistake. Okay, good to know. Why do you want to work here? I like the company. Okay. So we don't need to spend too much time with the bottom or the top. What's interesting is that 50% in the middle. And there, like, it's hard because it's a gray area. There can be pluses and minuses to people, but the two things that really stand out are sort of demonstrating an ability to grow, as we've talked about with acknowledging mistakes and being able to talk about those and the process that you learn from them, and showing a curiosity. And so that curiosity comes out in the form of, what questions do you have for me? And the questions that don't get you anywhere are, tell me about a typical day on the team. Uh, is this a new position or did someone leave? Are like just sort of the general details about the hiring process. What will be the next steps? All of those are legitimate questions. If you're honestly really curious about them, tell a little bit about why. So I'm interested in if this is a new position or if it's a backfill because I have experienced X, Y, and Z. That demonstrates a little bit more than just I needed a question, so I'm throwing it out there. It's still not a very good one, in my opinion, but it gets you above the bar. The things that will really make you stand out are the things that show you've done some research and that you have an opinion and you're open to your opinion being changed, especially if it ties back to earlier questions. So I think it was actually in one of the interviews I did with you, I had asked you an interview question of like, so how do you approach DevOps? What do you think DevOps is? At the end of the interview, you were like, I've been talking a lot about what DevOps is to me. I'm curious as to what DevOps means to you. So it turned it back around and made the relationship feel much more reciprocal rather than just being, I'm an interviewer, you're an interviewee, you're spilling the spiel, I'm taking it, we're seeing where it goes. But it was actually a back and forth of trying to get a sense of how do we make sense of some really funky technology terms, cultures, and ideas. And so that was a very simple question, but it acknowledged a lot of what had been happening and took it in an interesting direction. So I'm hopeful. Hopefully, not everyone is going to start doing that because, like, oh, that's an easy question. I can just ask them what their definition of what they asked me their definition was. The question has to come from a sense of a common ground. So that would be a simple example. More interesting examples, even further than that, are there's an interview I did where it was a publicly held company. And so I had done research on their stock price. I had done research on their 10K filings. I had looked at what products they had. And I had noticed that about 6 months before, their stock price had dropped by about 50%. And then it had been choppy for a little bit. And then it had stabilized, come up a little bit. And so I did some research and I thought I understood why that was. So I didn't just come in and be sort of the smart ass of be like, hey, I noticed your stock price dropped by 50%. What's up with that? Because again, that's not an interesting question. It doesn't show any, it shows like, okay, you're a smart ass who's kind of a troublemaker. I really don't know if I want to work with you. But if I came in and I said, look, I noticed that your stock price dropped by 50%. You've also, in your filings, talked about re-architecting and a strategic change that you took. Can you tell me a little bit about what indicators you've seen that strategy is really gaining traction and leading you in the right direction? And so it became a really like, oh, you've done some homework. You're interested in strategy and you understand the relationship between software architecture and the opportunities within business and the ability to respond to new opportunities. Let's talk about this more. And it became an interesting back and forth that allowed them to develop a slightly different sense of, is he just a technologist? Is he also, how adept will he be in the business side of it? How much will we need to explain about our culture and our business? When you're switching from one industry to another, how adept will you be at understanding the differences and similarities between industries? And so there are a lot of things like that you can do with publicly available information on companies that can lead you to some really interesting things. Sometimes there won't be something that like, ooh, stock price, cool. The other things are just developing an opinion. With Morningstar, I had used Moth for a long time. I had used Morningstar for a long time. And I had very clear opinions about when I would use one, when I would use the other, and the strengths and weaknesses of both. And so when I was asked for questions when I was interviewing for Morningstar, I asked very specifically, like, look, I've noticed that with the Morningstar.com site, I have a hard time getting general information. And so I always need to go to Motley Fool to get general information. And I come to Morningstar to try and confirm a couple of ideas and dig deep into them. What's behind the decision making and how are we trying to make a broader, more accessible website to folks who are sort of developing their investing path or looking to implement investing information rather than just like, we have tons of data, please look at it. And I asked it in a slightly more coherent fashion than I've described it right here, but I was able to have a combination of an understanding of strengths and weaknesses of the product offering. I was able to show the impact of some of those weaknesses, and I demonstrated a commitment to listen and be curious about what the answer was. And those created, again, that opportunity for a conversation and an opportunity for them to tell me a story.
Yeah, like just getting the other person to talk is a good thing. Like people, I mean, they're there to listen to you, but they also want to feel like you're interested in what you have to say. So certainly those kinds of probing questions that you think are going to get at what that person cares about, right? And yeah, like, and apparently I had forgotten that I had asked you that, but yeah, that's a real slick moment because all I did was re-ask a question that you had just asked me. But it's just like I saw the opportunity, like apparently it made a good impression, and that took no preparation, just doing that. But it was just a matter of, I heard a minute ago you said this, so I want to know more about that. Like, yeah, so many people just aren't demonstrating that they've been listening to anything you say.
Exactly.
It's just not that hard to be a little ahead. I was being interviewed by the CEO of a small insurance space startup. And I happened to have interviewed with another insurance startup, or previously in that search that was in, their space. I don't know if they were direct competitors or not, but I was talking about so how fast are you intending to grow? And they said, well, probably very slow, probably very deliberately. We'll probably just add another couple of devs over the next year. I said, that's interesting. Did you know that Bold Penguin is trying to hire 50 people this year? And because I had asked the same question, like previously, and it was just in the back of my head. And I told him something about one of his either competitors or peers that he didn't know. Right. And like, man, just a random shot there. I wasn't walking into that with the intent of doing that, but that kind of active listening, prevented that really good opportunity.
Yeah. Active listening is a massive secret weapon that if you can pay attention to what people say, if you can have paid enough attention to see the principles and what they care about behind it, you have opportunities to ask really cool questions. Or even if you aren't, like, I've actively listened and I'm not quite sure, you've told me what I've heard from you is that you care about this, this, and this. Are there other things that you care about more? I'm not quite sure the relationship between these. Can you tell me more about why these are so important? And so that opportunity to ask a question that is reactive to what you've heard in the interview doesn't require, as you say, any previous research, any preparation. It requires you to have paid attention and cared about what the person is saying.
Absolutely. My go-to when I don't have another is tell me about some of the pain points your team has. Everyone's gonna have an answer to that, and it'll both like get them thinking about like those things. It'll show you think critically. You don't have to do anything different to ask that question. You can, like, I've done things where I've been talking to different people on for one company's interview, and I'll just ask them all that same question, and whether I get the same answer from them all or I get a different one tells me interesting stuff. And then like for bonus points, maybe in the last interview you mentioned, I've asked everyone what their pain points were, and these are some of the different answers I've got. Like work that into one of your answers. It's just like it's a gimme if you can ask them some interesting question about that's not just tell me about a day in the life.
Right. And I suspect one of the things you do is when they answer it, you then tie that back to the story you've told about yourself or things that they've mentioned in the past. So it's not just a gimme question of tell me about your pain points. Okay, I've ticked the box. I asked a question. Go me. It's, oh, okay, you're interested in pain point X and pain point Y. I've dealt with those. This is how I've approached those. Or that's really interesting. Usually when I see pain point X and pain point Y, I also see pain point Z. Is that something you're also dealing with? And so that ability to make connections, extrapolate, draw from your experience, talk about that, it gives you a great opportunity to, again, deepen the conversation and create a personal connection between you, the person interviewing you, and the company they represent.
Yeah, have you thought about doing this related to that? Yeah, you've probably, might have seen something, or if not, you can still ask them, right? Like,
exactly.
What would you, with the magic wand, if the CTO came to you and said, how are we going to solve that problem? Try and engage them, and you can get them to just sort of give you the information that they want to have come back out of you.
Yep. Absolutely.
But that's yeah. There's lots of things you can do there. But just yeah, do something interesting that talks to the kind of things they think are important. Um, so what other advice do you have for candidates? Anything really crucial that we haven't already covered?
I think that pretty much covers the major points of interviewing. And just to sort of summarize again, the things that really matter to me are the ability to tell a story, to make it feel like a actual conversation rather than an interrogation, or rather than just a brain dump from one way or the other way, and to be able to show growth and curiosity. Those are the two big things that companies, especially around technology, are really interested in, because the technology that I work with now did not exist when I started my career. The technology that I started my career with didn't exist when I was in school. And so I'm not that old. I'm ancient, but I'm not that old. And that's just going to get more so. The explosion of technologies, the explosion of practices, the explosion of processes is accelerating. And how companies are taking advantage of it, the opportunities that companies get because of that are changing so quickly that you need to be able to show that you're adaptable and that you're interested in being adaptable. And that's really going to help distinguish you from, okay, you're smart and you know Java. Cool. That's useful. You're smart and you know .NET. You're smart and you know Chef. Excellent. We've got a lot of people like that. And with the modern CS programs, they are churning out more and more people who fit that description faster and faster and faster. Coding boot camps are facilitating people who didn't have some of that, switching from just being smart and doing something different to knowing Java, knowing .NET, knowing various JavaScript libraries, and being able to do front end programming. In order to distinguish ourselves as candidates, we have to show that experience and has changed us, to show that our personalities allow us to grow from our experience, that we aren't an example I use in general for software development is, if you develop a piece of software 10 years ago, it's probably not going to be that great now. So if you look at sort of the personal website space, the things that Drupal or WordPress, they're not terribly great these days, especially compared to something like Squarespace and things that allow you to do really interesting, graphically driven, easy web development from just an automated product. If you look at things like social networks, Friendster and MySpace died horrible deaths. Facebook, on the other hand, has showed a adaptability, a curiosity, and a growth that is somewhat parasitic, but is really successful. And so regardless of how you look at that, what they've been able to do in terms of technological abilities and flexibility, and their flexibility and curiosity about how do we survive in a social network space, what is a social network, how do people use it differently, has been really important to them thriving as a company. And those same things we need to do, especially once you start getting beyond the 5 years in technology and into where I am with 20 years in technology. Why the hell do you want to hire an old white dude? There are a lot more interesting people who know a lot more about the technology that's currently being used. And so more and more, I got to be on my toes for, this is what makes me interesting. This is what makes me unique. This is why my story is compelling. And the sooner we start practicing that in our interview process, the more adept and the better we'll get at it.
Interesting. Are there any other resources that you recommend for people to look into? We'll throw them in the description, or any other things you'd like to plug?
So, the one thing, interviews are about communication, they are about telling a story, as we've been talking about. So, it's really useful to listen to storytellers and to practice public speaking. So there's some people who love things like Toastmasters. I did Toastmasters for a while. There's a lot of value in getting comfortable talking in front of people. That said, Toastmasters, in my opinion, runs into a little bit of a problem of feeling very formulaic. And so it's really good to balance that with listening to folks on The Moth, is one of my favorite other storytelling podcasts, because they don't follow any of the rules. They are informal, they are conversational, they are crude, they are incredibly compelling when they tell their stories. There are lots of other storytellers out there, obviously very established ones like This American Life tells really great stories. They're very curated. There are lots of new ones coming up, but spend time listening to people that tell stories and try and figure out why their stories are interesting. How much of it is the content? How much of it is the quality of the telling? What are the techniques they use? What are the techniques they break? Or not the rules they break that work? And I think those are really useful things that help you add an extra pop to your interview and to understand when we talk about, oh, you should tell a story, what does it mean to tell a story? Is my story going to be interesting? So those are all really interesting things that I think if you want to get geeky about it and go down that rabbit hole, and it's a big rabbit hole, those are some places to start.
Great, great. That's definitely a more unique referral than just like cracking the coding interview book and stuff. So that's really cool. So I think we've got a great library of material right now in this episode. I want to thank you for coming on, Stephen. And
thank you.
Of course, normally the send off is what Lao Tzu said in the Tao Te Ching: "With patience, the most tangled cord may be undone." But I will give you the last word, Stephen.
So I go with Zhuangzi over Lao Tzu. And so from Zhuangzi, to be truly ignorant, be content with your own knowledge.
All right. Subscribe.
Thank you.